Welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a good break. We are excited to start our next presentation, which is all about implementation science, and being provided by Marianne Farkas, who is one of our iSPARC collaborators. She is at the Center for Psychiatric Rehabilitation at Boston University, and our own Gina Vincent, who is in our iSPARC in the Department of Psychiatry.
Shall I begin? Thank you very much, Marianne. Good afternoon, everyone. And I want to thank DMH and the two centers for having this conference and giving us all an opportunity to learn from each other. As Marianne said, I'm very pleased to be a consultant and collaborator with iSPARC, working on a current technical assistance project, which you'll hear more about from my colleague, Gina Vincent. And I represent the Center for Psychiatric Rehabilitation, and which is a national and international research service demonstration and implementation knowledge translation center, in which over 50% of the researchers, providers, and implementation specialists are people with lived experience, just as an aside. So I'd like to introduce my colleague, Gina Vincent. Gina?
Yeah, thank you, Marianne. Hello, everybody. As the first Marianne mentioned, I'm an associate professor in psychiatry at iSPARC, and I'm representing our technical assistance program, which is new. And as Marianne Farkas mentioned, our main goal lately has been to assist DMH and its contracted providers with enhancing implementation of adult community clinical services and that new model. And so we're going to be talking about that a little bit later during the presentation.
Thank you, Gina. So today, as everyone said, we're going to talk about implementation and implementation science. And first, I'm going to talk about the field of implementation science in general and why it's important in plain language, because I know some people are really well versed in this topic area and others not so much. I don't want you to fall asleep. So that's why we'll go the plain language route. Then Gina is going to share some specific drivers of implementation, and we'll give you a taste of what it's like to apply these ideas using a current project that she mentioned on implementing ACCS services as an example. And if you're interested in learning more, we're going to give you a link to use to follow up on this and any other technical assistance needs you might have at the end of our presentation. So we thought we would begin with a poll and see what you think of these questions related to implementation. So if whoever is launching the poll could launch it, please, I'd appreciate it. So just type in what you think is the correct answer. How long does it take for an innovation or tool found to be effective through research to get into the hands of people who can use it? For the poll to work, you have to enter your answer, and it will show what people are generally believing the answer to be. So just click on which one you think is the answer. I don't see on my screen any responses.
No, the poll is still going on. We have about 70% of attendees have voted.
Okay.
I'm just going to give it a couple more seconds if you would like to click your answer.
Click my own answer?
No. All right,
Okay.
it looks like
I'm not used to not seeing the results as they appear. So I'm sorry, that's why I'm a little confused. All right.
Okay.
So, whoops. There we go. Perfect. All right, let's go on to question number 2. Question number 2. Most people think that it's 2 to 10 years. percentage of clients with behavioral health conditions interested in work are getting an evidence-based practice to help them get work? What do you think? What percentage of clients with behavioral health conditions who are interested in work are getting an evidence-based practice to help them do that, get work? So again, we'll give you a few seconds here, and then we'll move on. So we're going to whiz through these questions. Dee, if you could again show me how people are responding, that would be really helpful. Thank you. Okay. Let's try number 3 then. The reasons so many do not get the interventions that we know are effective are, you can check all that you think apply. Staff are new and don't have the knowledge or skills to deliver it. Services don't have the funding they need to deliver it. Managers and leadership often don't believe new practices are worth the cost in time and effort, or none of the above. You can check all that you think are true. Okay. Dee, how are we doing? Thank God for you, Dee. Okay, most people believe that services do not have the funding to deliver the new practice, and that staff are new and don't have the knowledge or skills. Great, thanks. All right, last question, I promise, then we won't torture you anymore. The best way to get new interventions delivered on a regular basis to people who need them is to train staff, reward staff for using the new intervention, change the way records are kept, change treatment procedures to include the new intervention, identify ways to include the new intervention in the agency's billing codes. Which one or ones of these do you believe is the best way? I should say the best ways to get new interventions delivered. Whoops. Okay. Dee, how are we doing?
Folks are still answering. I'll give it 1 or 2 more seconds and then I'll close it.
All right. So the most popular ones are to train staff and to change treatment procedures to include the new interventions, but that's followed closely by changing the record keeping and identifying new ways to include the intervention in the agency's billing code. Okay, well, thank you for indulging us in this little poll. Seems to me that we have a pretty savvy group here. So as we go along, hopefully you'll get some of the answers to the questions that we posed. We know, for example, however, that getting new interventions into services is complex. And how do I get this to move ahead? Ah, here it is. Thank you. Some of you might be familiar with this picture from the 1980s movie, The Field of Dreams. In this movie, Kevin Costner plays a highly motivated person who turns his cornfield into a baseball field, hoping this effort will bring legendary players to play baseball in his backyard. Similar to Kevin Costner, we invest a lot of time and effort in developing new methods and tools with the motto, unspoken, if you build it, they will come. But who promises us that if we, quote, build these new interventions, practitioners in the field will actually use what we are developing? We know that science in general is about making an impact in the world. In the health and rehabilitation professions, we're looking to positively impact the lives of people challenged by their health conditions. We develop and test our ideas as we create interventions backed up with evidence about their effectiveness in helping people fulfill their potential. Unfortunately, it takes 20 to 25 years, even though many people thought it takes 2 to 10 years in our poll, it actually takes 20 to 25 years from the time we prove that something is effective to the time it becomes available to the people who could benefit from them. And in today's world, with all the rapid advances that are going on, some of the interventions that finally make it to the field might not even be relevant after so much time. Well, why is this? Well, not everybody is as excited about changing their practice as the scientists who have discovered something new are. Only 50% of clinical innovations make it into general usage, according to Bauer and his colleagues in 2020. People tend to push back, even when the new practice offered to them has clear benefits. For example, we know that on average in publicly funded human services, the innovations that we deliver are implemented as intended about 50% of the time. And the resulting service gap has been well documented. Martin and his colleagues have said that all countries can be viewed as developing in the context of mental health provision. Constraints in funding, staff turnover, lack of adequate training, etc., are global concerns, not just concerns here locally. Only 12.5% of people with a mental health condition identify themselves as recovered or in recovery. And this is despite the fact that we have data that shows that 1/2 to 2/3 of the population can recover. 24% report an unmet need for community mental health treatment. Access to recovery-oriented interventions is still limited. Only 0.3 of the eligible population receive supported employment services, another question from our poll. 3%, a little better, receive supported housing. In case we think that's only a US problem, in the UK, only 10% of eligible people with serious mental health conditions receive CBT for psychosis. And even with this, we're doing comparatively well. In low to middle income countries, 90% of people with mental health conditions receive no services at all. So this process of bringing science into practical use, of overcoming what the World Health Organization calls the no-do gap, is called implementation. Successful implementation requires systematic planning and thinking to have wheels to get beyond just a good idea, so it can get off the block and actually get somewhere. Implementation science can guide the creation of plans that are successful and help to make evidence-based practices part of everyday services. So is implementation science, or are implementation science and implementation different? Implementation is a specified set of activities designed to be put into practice a particular activity or program that is well described. The implementation processes are generally purposeful and described in sufficient detail that somebody else can identify the fact that they're being used. So I want to give you an example of implementation. So the first observation that citrus cures scurvy in the British Navy occurred in 1601, in case you think this is new. The first randomized controlled trial of citrus to treat scurvy was conducted in 1747. The implementation of citrus to prevent scurvy by the British Navy didn't happen for another 50 years, 1795. When it was implemented, you could see the process. There was a Navy handbook that described it step by step, who announced it, who bought the oranges and lemons, how much was to be bought, how it was handed out, what happened if a sailor refused. All of those are elements of implementation per se, a specified set of activities. Implementation science, as Marianne Davis already mentioned earlier on, is a study of the methods, not so much about the doing, but a study of the methods learning how it all works. So why did it take so long? What works to overcome the 50-year gap between the realization that citrus prevents scurvy and sailors getting those lemons and oranges when they put out to sea? How do we think about the complexity of provider behavior, agency infrastructure, system resources, and supports to bring them all together to create a sustainable practice? Implementation science has only been with us for about 60 years as a field, whereas obviously implementation itself has been going on for much longer. And much of the initial work we've done has just been to describe and understand how sustainable implementation happens. So I think most people's eyes would glaze over if I went through the different frameworks that have been developed. So I'm just going to name some of them and give you a flavor of what the field has come up with in implementation science. Then I'm going to turn it over to Gina to present the framework that we've been using to help support DMH's implementation of adult community care services, or ACCS. Okay, so the first example here, the first type of framework is a descriptive framework in which the scientists figure out what are all the things to think about if you're looking to learn what elements affect implementation in what way. And perhaps the most famous framework is called CFIRE, Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research, which you see there. So CFIRE itemizes what variables to document when describing an implementation effort, what influences its success or failure. For example, the characteristics of the people who have to deliver the intervention, but also the characteristics of the organizational setting that's doing the implementation, or the agency that wants to deliver this new intervention. The characteristics of the intervention itself that make it harder or easier to put into place. For example, things like how adaptable is the intervention, how complex, how costly, what is the quality of the design of the intervention, and the packaging, the marketing, which is very important in terms of attracting users, as well as some of these other characteristics. Okay, so that is an example of a descriptive framework that is well known in the field. Another framework is process-oriented. And a good example of a process-oriented framework is called knowledge to action. Excuse me. And this is a framework for those who want to learn more about what is the flow of implementation? What do you have to do in what order to be successful? Again, the purpose of systematizing these ideas, example, adapting the knowledge to local context, assessing barriers and facilitators to knowledge use, is to be able to study the process of implementation in order to improve it. Many others have concentrated on what makes the process itself move, or the levers or drivers of change. I like alliteration, so I tried to reduce these things to 3 simple C's, what I call the 3 C's. Paying attention to the culture of the organization, and the system implementing the change. For example, involving the people most affected by the change in the design, implementation, and evaluation of this change. Paying attention to the extent of commitment of different layers of stakeholders and elements that seem to influence whether or not they're going to hang on for the long run, rather. Paying attention to the capacity of the program and the staff to implement the change, both in terms of resources and skills. So I've tried in these few minutes to explain the problem. We learn new ways to help people. It takes forever for the people we care about to benefit from these new ways. Implementation science is about describing what does it really take to successfully move from science to practice, and to then integrate that intervention into daily service delivery. We've learned some things, and there are many more that we're working on right now to try to understand better. Now, Gina is going to describe the framework that we're actually using right now to help support the move of ACCS to practice. Gina?
Yep.
I'm going to stop sharing.
Okay, great. I'll start sharing my screen here. Okay, so Marianne just did a great overview of a huge area of science in about 15 minutes, and she did a fantastic job. I'm assuming you all can see my slides now. Marianne, if you're not, I can see you. Wonderful. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is take you all through an exercise. As Marianne mentioned, there are many different frameworks from implementation science. The one we are using with ACCS is known as the Active Implementation Frameworks from Dean Fixon. And they have their own version of implementation drivers, which again are the key components of the infrastructure and the capacity that influence the successful use of some new program or innovation or new model, or whatever it is that we're trying to put into place. These are the drivers that help us do that successfully. There's 3 implementation driver domains, and within each of these are specific processes, which I'll go through in a minute. As I'm going through these, I'm going to ask you all to think back to the previous presentation from Dr. Evans, where she was talking about the smoking cessation program, and think about which of these drivers may need to be leveraged and what might need to be changed in order for that smoking cessation program to be implemented into ACCS, which again is the Adult Community Clinical Services model from DMH. And we're going to have a little bit of discussion about that. So just to get you thinking about her program, and she already mentioned a number of factors that would improve implementation. This is not only going to help us all to think about what good implementation means, but it's also going to help Dr. Evans because she's now getting funded to do an implementation study. And so this may help her think about some things that haven't come up. So to start, competency drivers. As this sounds, these can be leveraged to improve staff competence and confidence. So for example, there are 3 processes within here. Selection, how do you select and identify and retain the right staff who are going to be a good fit? Training staff, we all know about training. And then coaching of staff so that they are continually honing their skills around the model that you're adopting or the new program that you're adopting. Leadership drivers are also very critical. And a fair bit of implementation science has shown that sometimes when the leadership changes within an agency, whatever innovation or program was adopted starts to falter. And so you want to set up leadership so that it's continuous regardless of whether your leader changes. Having leaders that are good problem solvers and work with others on their team to come up with solutions to challenges are going to be very effective at managing challenges as they arise. Leaders also become very important because they carry the message to all the practitioners and staff within their agency around the importance of whatever it is that they're adopting. So they continually message the importance of this. They also help change the culture of an organization. For example, one culture that an organization can have that makes them very effective at client services is if the leaders of the agency have a philosophy that clinicians are going to place the well-being of the client first, and if clinicians are always competent and up to date on the latest knowledge. So that culture of placing the client first is a very effective culture when it comes to administrating services. Lastly, and this one is a little more complicated because there's so many nuances to this, are the organization drivers. These are processes that will help enable implementation of a new program to be put into place by trying to change the system or the context in which it's going into. So that in order to ensure that everyone can adopt and implement this model in the same way. We know that, we call that fidelity. Fidelity means we're all following the practice the way that we should be following it. So for example, if you all are adopting motivational interviewing, which is a big component of ACCS, and frankly, a big component of many of the services DMH provides, if everyone were doing that in the same way, you would see direct care staff, practitioners, clinicians, and everyone maybe asking clients open-ended questions when clients are coming with a behavior or a relationship that's not working for them or is having a negative impact on them. motivational interviewing would say we're supposed to ask open-ended questions so that client can come to their own assessment of the impact that that behavior or relationship is having on their life. And then you may be able to work with a client around how they could change that. That's a much better philosophy than just telling clients what to do, which tends not to work. So if we're adopting motivational interviewing well, everyone who's working with that client is going to do it in the same way. That means we're doing it with fidelity. Examples of organizational drivers that we can use to help improve implementation of a new program are things like decision support tools. So cheat sheets for all practitioners, tip sheets, so that they know kind of the recipe of what it is that they're trying to do. Consistent treatment planning documents, changing the documents, changing the electronic data system so that it's feasible and user-friendly and is tracking the kind of data that you need in order to be able to tell if your program is working. Developing new written policies and procedures may be another piece. Lastly, this really important one, system intervention, is an organizational driver. And that's where we think about how ACCS or some other program is operating within the system that involves other providers, other agencies that may cause barriers to implementation of your program. And how do we work with those other systems in order to help make this a more fluid process? So for example, crisis support teams with ACCS, crisis support teams are something you interface with quite often, and sometimes those systems don't align well. Okay, just a couple more. I'm just going to highlight a couple more pieces about some of these processes that I think are really important. One is coaching and supervision is a very important competency driver. Many people think that training staff is enough. Research tells us that staff training is actually insufficient for changing the way practitioners do their work. And so any training should be followed up by coaching in real time, observing individuals doing their work with a client and providing them feedback in real time. That's going to be much more effective. Another important component from the organizational drivers is the support data system. The data system should be able to answer two questions for you. If something's not working, so let's say ACCS isn't working, is it because we have a fidelity problem? So the different contracted providers are not all following the model in the same way? Or is it because we really have an effectiveness problem, meaning the model doesn't work? So if we look at the outcomes that we want to achieve, which is improving community tenure, if that's not happening, we need to have a data system that tells us whether that's because the model just doesn't work or because the contracted providers haven't been able to follow the model to fidelity. Okay, so now I'm going to pose some questions to you. Think back to that smoking cessation program that Dr. Evans presented, and think about if that were implemented in ACCS, which I think most of you know, ACCS is implemented by a number of different DMH contracted providers and some DMH staff. There are some DMH offices that do it as well in the Southeast. I'm going to ask first, what are some of the leadership or organizational cultural changes that may need to occur or just be put into place in order to help that smoking cessation program be effective? I'm going to ask you to put your thoughts in the Q&A box. I think we've agreed on doing it in the Q&A box, but Dee, I can't see the Q&A box. Are you willing to monitor it for me?
Yep, I'm monitoring it, and we do have a question for when we get to the Q&A.
Okay. Any thoughts about what kind of leadership would be effective in helping adopt and implement the smoking cessation program?
So we have accept CHW workers into programs.
Good, yes. So we want to have leadership that helps promote integration of these new workers into their agency. Yes. Any other thoughts?
Transparency.
What was that, Dee?
Transparency. And then
Planned? Go ahead.
transparency, like making sure people can see what you're doing.
Good, so
Increase-
leadership is transparent.
Sorry.
Go ahead,
Increase
sorry.
educational level of caseworkers. And leadership must embrace and support smoking cessation efforts.
Okay, great. Can I pause right there? So that right there is key, that the leadership is embracing this as important, and they're carrying that message to all of the practitioners and staff in their agency. That's a key piece, and probably reinforcing why this is important. So Dr. Evans gave a lot of research information that indicates how smoking may affect symptoms of mental illness.
So a few more are have the leaders themselves try to quit smoking and share their experiences.
That is a great one. So if leaders are modeling good behavior, having them smoke is not going to be terribly helpful. That is a great point.
And advertising.
And there was, sorry, go ahead, Dee.
Sorry, advertising is another idea.
Okay.
A 6-month follow-up to reinforce the new culture.
Okay, good. So we talked about the importance of constant messaging, actually. So a 6-month follow-up is good as a benchmark for reinforcing the positive culture, but leaders that are doing constant messaging around the importance of a new initiative or program are going to help that be more effective. You can never message it enough.
Sorry.
Yes.
Gina, this is Marianne. Can I just add something to what you're saying?
Yes. Yeah.
Sometimes the cultural change that has to happen, and you alluded to this earlier, has to do with whether or not people really believe in the intervention. Apart from the evidence, if you think about the field that I've been working in for a long time, there are a lot of people who don't believe that people with serious mental health conditions can really work. So if you don't believe that people can really work, you're not going to be invested in an intervention to make it work. And that happens with smoking cessation as well. Some people believe it's self-medication and that we really shouldn't be trying to stop people from smoking. So just wanted to mention that.
Yeah. Yeah, your point's very well taken. Please do help, feel free to interject. Another area where leaders can be effective is if there's some provision of incentives. So there's some incentives for practitioners within their agency when they're doing this well. Maybe it's simply praise. So maybe there's a monthly best employee that's identified. And so it's praise. Sometimes there's other incentives agencies are able to give, like maybe a couple hours time off or something for doing good work and promoting the practice. Sorry, Dee, was there another leadership point?
So yes, well-informed and trained leadership.
Yes, great. That's a great.
Incentive smoking cessations for CLSs and leadership.
Good.
Include, oh, sorry.
That's good. Why don't we stop there? And because I would have a couple more questions that we want to get to. Thank you, Dee. You're doing wonderful moderating. Second, what are some of the competency drivers that may be necessary in order to implement the smoking cessation program? These ones tend to be a little more tangible and concrete. And again, you can put these in the Q&A. Someone mentioned one earlier along with the leadership drivers, which was about training staff, I think I heard Dee say. I would consider that to be a competency driver, an important competency driver.
Yes, one says offer training and support. Many people do not know how to write a tobacco quit plan or know how to properly use the medications for tobacco cessation. For example, you don't chew nicotine gum is one answer.
Excellent, good. That's good. So developing staff skills.
Including peers could be important.
Yep, and the inclusion of peers, I think that there's a competency driver to leverage there, probably for training the peer specialists or peer staff. There's also an organizational driver there, which Dr. Evans had alluded to, just starting to involve peers, which it sounded like was an area that they wanted to get into with the model.
Yes, one person wrote in, analyze why CPS were not a good fit initially. I think talking more about Dr. Evans' program.
Okay. Some other areas of competency drivers, which these are things Dr. Evans mentioned already, is just hiring, good hiring practices for these community health workers. So that's something that ACCS would need to put into place, because they need to identify these people and identify staff that are going to be a good fit for that position. And then there's training, and then there's coaching, right? So that on the most important part of the competency driver is any training, any formal training, be followed up with observational coaching. So watching how those community health workers are interacting with clients randomly. So, you know, maybe a few times every 6 months, maybe more often, and being able to give them feedback around how that's going. So it would be a really critical competency driver. And the last one, what are some of the organizational drivers to consider putting into place or leveraging in order to facilitate success of the smoking cessation program in ACCS? And I really want to key you in, because Dr. Evans did talk about this a bit, key you into some systems intervention. What other systems are at play here that would need to be prepped or brought on board? But you can also think about other organizational drivers we discussed.
So organizationally, an administrative allotment of time for scheduling and resources, time and staff for delivering cessation services.
Yes, great. That is something many leaders don't think about, is how to make the space and make time for existing staff to function and work and implement a new program.
And then this is probably a leadership driver. Need to be realistic about available staff time and effort, and avoid adding a new intervention on top of old responsibilities of an already overloaded workforce.
Yep, thank you for that point. I cannot emphasize that one enough. Anytime that we're working with an agency and they want to adopt something new, one of the first things we ask them is, what can this replace? Or what can be taken away? Or can you hire new staff that are just responsible for this piece, so it's not being added to an existing workload? Critically important, thinking about the staff hours that are being put in and how to make it feasible. So feasibility is a really important driver within here. So thank you all for that feedback. I'm going to leave you with this, as Marianne alluded to, as both of them alluded to. We have a website, the iSPARC website. Within that is a page, and I've given you the link directly to this page here, where you can go and request technical assistance from iSPARC. The technical assistance you're requesting here is typically, we offer up to 36 hours of free technical assistance, thanks to DMH, who's covering the funding for that. And that can be very small, basic TA, like doing a lit review, conducting a focus group, helping you to think through outcome measures that you want to adopt for your program. So this is how to make those requests. As we mentioned, our big TA project right now is with ACCS, but these smaller requests can come in this way. And any questions? I think you actually might need to cut me off, but maybe we have time for one question.
Dee, did we have one question come in?
We did have one question come in. Oops.
Perfect.
From Ken Farbstein. He said, please describe an example of how you've helped speed the implementation of an evidence-based practice in a way that has helped people with serious mental illness.
Help speed. And so I think that this is, well, Marianne may have some thoughts about that. I will just give a comment that good implementation means slowing down and taking time. And these things don't get implemented quickly and you expect outcomes right away. It means having a thoughtful, comprehensive process. So how do you speed up a thoughtful, comprehensive process? I'm going to ask Marianne if she has any thoughts about that.
Well, in 30 seconds or less, I think the only thing I would say is that we are engaged in a 5-year grant at the moment where we're looking at exactly that question. How can we take a scaling up approach to an evidence-based practice, which in our case is cognitive remediation, and put it into the state of Georgia in less time with less resources? And as you said, Gina, we know that it takes people as long as it takes for them to really change their practice. So we're looking for efficiencies in the process and in the amount of expert input that is necessary to actually implement it. And we'll tell you in about a year and a half if we've managed if we've managed this question. We can get back to Ken with the answer, we hope. Stay tuned.
Thank you to Gina and Marianne. And I'll just add one quick thing to that question is that the way that people now develop the interventions that may become evidence-based practices has changed as a result of realizing how long it takes to do so. So it used to be you could sort of develop it in a kind of a classic ivory tower and then try to go implement it out in the real world. And they're really encouraging folks to do what they call sort of a blend of both testing that it's effective while also testing it in the real world to begin with, so you don't have to take that transition from the ivory tower, so to speak, out to the real world. So that should be helping also, but heavens knows we need to reduce that timeline from 20 to 25 years to much, much less. So thanks so much for that presentation, guys.